I'm so happy to be here with Bryant Cruse, who is the founder of New Sapience, but that is just the latest in a number of things that has painted his career into this wonderful masterpiece of technology and research and computers. And I'm so glad to have you here on the Everything's the Primary Source podcast.
Thank you, Eric. I'm glad to be here.
So when we had a guest of mine from years ago, James Maynard, suggested that we talk to each other. He and I spent time talking about Cosmos, Carl Sagan's program for PBS, and he connected me to you, saying that you've been working with AI for a lot longer than AI has become part of our zeitgeist. Can you tell my audience a little bit about your career and your connection to AI?
Well, my career in AI started, I came to AI through space. I was a space systems engineer. And you talk about the current zeitgeist. Yes, AI is on everybody's lips these days. But there was actually a previous heyday back in the mid 80s. In those days, the technology of what they called AI was very different. But I came to it to solve a very practical problem, not one that not based on some theory about what intelligence wants necessarily. But I was working at Goddard Space Flight Center, getting the Hubble Space Telescope ready to launch and to operate. And my job was to train some of the people who would sit in the Mission Control Center and control Hubble from the ground to take its observations. And I came into that from my previous career as a naval aviator, where I flew large airplanes out over the Atlantic. And when I sat down and saw how people were operating the spacecraft, I thought, this is not right. Basically, it was like a science project, and that they had a number of people in the control center, and that's still the way they operate spacecraft today, by and large. At least NASA does. If you look at the pictures of mission control at Houston, there's 100 people sitting at computer consoles, and in those days it was rather primitive. You looked at numbers on a tabular display on a CRT tube of a computer, and it would give you measurements of coming down from the spacecraft about the state status of it, but it didn't tell you state status. It said battery voltage 28.2, relay position 128, open, or just numbers on screens essentially. And I thought, if I had to fly an aircraft looking at numbers on screens, you wouldn't get very far.
No.
So I took on a mission, kind of a personal mission. Can we get the computers to do the number crunching and apply knowledge of what those numbers mean automatically in software, and then present to the operators displays of state and status about the spacecraft that they could act on immediately, like we do in an aircraft. So at the time, so that launched my career in AI, because in those days, AI meant a rule-based expert system, which was, you basically could say, write a rule and say, if battery 6 voltage is this, and battery 6 temperature is that, and battery 6, then the state of the battery is reconditioning discharge or something. And you could do that. And so I launched a career in AI attempting to solve that problem. Founded 2 companies to apply AI, that kind of AI. Well, first, that kind of AI didn't work that well. And we looked at what would later become today's AI, which was machine learning, artificial neural networks, and that didn't seem like it would apply either. Certainly not in those days. So my second company, we pioneered a new method, and that did work. It was probably arguably the first time that you could say that you've actually captured knowledge that was curated directly from human mind and captured in a computer that could then be out that incoming data, and that worked very well. And then later on, after my first 2 companies were acquired by public companies, I had some time to think about what I had learned about AI in general. and realize that it might be possible to capture knowledge in a more abstract, general way, that is abstract and common sense knowledge into a computer. And if you could do
Mm.
that, you would have the fundamentals you needed to create computers that actually understood like human language and understood the common sense world and could reason and think in a way that would be directly commensurate or analogous to the way humans do. Quite unlike what we have today, by the way, which
I was
presents
going to.
compelling appearance of intelligence without actually having any.
So what you're saying is that what you're mostly interested in developing is something that would be able to understand a human in the way our minds think and the
Yes.
way that we're rational or even irrational and the emotions that we have. Because I think that that's um, one of the fears, and it's been expressed through media, I think, as long as there's been movies, for example. I mean, you think about going all the way back to the silent age, you had movies like Metropolis that dealt with automatons and how they would interact with humans, and even there's a Charlie Chaplin movie, Modern Times, where there's automatic stuff. And of course, moving all the way through, including the movie we're going to talk about today, and into the era of the Terminator and iRobot, this fear that we can make artificial intelligence, but it's exciting, but at the same time scary because how do you keep that in check? How do you reel it in? How do you keep it from? And it seems like the big key would be the emotional side, that common sense side that AI doesn't have, right? It's just kind of like a blank, only logical. It doesn't really seem to have that kind of. So what you're developing would kind of maybe uh, calm down the fears of people saying AI could be out of control pretty quickly.
By the way, as you probably know, the idea of robots goes back to ancient Greece. There was Talos was a giant bronze automaton who,
Hmm.
even that, he kind of ran around doing things that wasn't clear he was
Yeah,
like,
and there's like Golem or
yes,
Golem from
right.
Hebrew mythology and things.
But
It's
yes,
been on the minds of people for forever, right?
and there's
Like if
always
we
been
can
fear, and there's
make
always been fear. Mhm.
if we can create things artificially, what will that do for us in a positive way? But how do you keep it in check?
Well, there is a way to keep it in check, and the kind of approach we're taking to it is inherently should would in, inherently not prone to that kind of running amok. And it's not that we're going to give them emotions, but we're
Hmm.
going to give them the understanding of emotions to understand that humans have emotions. Okay, but not giving them the same emotions.
Hmm.
It's like you would like the ideal psychologist would understand your emotions and they psychoanalyze you, but wouldn't be emotionally involved in them,
Right.
wouldn't be projecting their issues on you. But there are two fundamental basis for the perennial fear of AIs running amok, as it were. Uh, the um, the ultimate one is that is based on intelligence in the sense that, and that's what we call the singularity. You've Ray Kurzweil's popularized, and others, science fiction writers, I think, and others who have talked about a singularity. And the idea of the singularity is that if we could build robots that were as intelligent as we are, then we could build ones that were more intelligent than we are. But then those robots could build robots that were more intelligent than them, and so on and so on and so on. And you predict this exponential curve of robot intelligence. And so
Hmm.
all things that you have these entities out there who are as far above us in intelligence as we are above a flea or a mouse or something, whatever. And so that's inherently frightening because we wouldn't be able to understand them or their motivations. So, and that seems like a legitimate fear. But when you break
Yeah.
it down from our point of view, it is not. Why? Because what does it mean to build an AI? What does AI mean? What is it? What does intelligence mean? And that's what we often at these Sapiens like to point out to people that if the term AI is to mean anything, you can't mean something different by intelligence in a machine and intelligence in a human. They've got to be the same thing. Or so what does that mean? Well, what is intelligence in a human? Think about it from first principles. It is the fact that we have knowledge of the world. We have an internal model of the external world, which allows us to make good decisions. We can predict what will happen because we built that internal model up and a mental model of the external world. Now, that's not controversial. Everybody agrees that that's really the essence of our intelligence. So knowledge, AI, would be a computer that had internal models of the world. But where does that come from, and how do we create that? It's going to be based on humans' knowledge of the world. So it's going to be, anything that we build is going to be fundamentally a descendant or a creation of our understanding of knowledge of the world. So what is knowledge? It's a model, but models aren't susceptible of being infinitely good or infinitely bad. You look at our history of science, which is the best models that we have about nature and the world, and they are continually being refined and updated, and one's replacing another. The model of the ancient Greeks with the sun going around the earth at the center, was perfectly scientific based on their observations, and they were able to do great things with it. Navigate around the earth, calculate the size of the earth. But Newton came along and changed all that, and his model was broader and better, but was his true and theirs false? The figure of merit for knowledge is utility. So we're going to build AIs. We're going to give them knowledge that is curated from our perspective and our knowledge of the world. It's not susceptible to going to infinity. We're always going to understand. We can make them intelligent. We can make them have more knowledge. We can make them better at creating new knowledge that we are. But it's ultimately going to be something that we understand. You can't make an infinitely good model. People talk about infinite intelligence or being mystical. It's like they think intelligent is like some mystical substance, like phlogiston or some fluid that you could have an infinite quantity of it. That's just magical thinking. So we don't have to worry about them becoming infinitely intelligent and so we don't understand them. Well, what else do we fear about them? Well, the other fear is that they, being more intelligent, if knowledge gives us power, and they have more knowledge than us and greater mental capacity to use that knowledge, which is perfectly reasonable, and in fact, probably inevitable. Well, that scares us. Why? Because if they're smarter than we are, how can we trust them? Where does that come from? And if you look at where that comes from, it's really an anthropomorphism. It comes from the fact that the only intelligence entity that we are aware of is human beings, in the sense, again, we measure our intelligence by the knowledge that we can communicate. Not to say that other animals aren't intelligent, whales and things like that, but if they create knowledge and accumulate knowledge, it's not the way we do it, and they don't apply it. So that's something else. But in our sense, and being able to have hands and apply that knowledge, that we associate having knowledge with the desire to apply that knowledge to change the world, right? Because we have it. And we have it for the same reason we have intelligence in the first place, because it evolved part and parcel with hands and intelligence, the ability to build models, and having a desire and motivation to use that knowledge to change the world, because that was the evolutionary impetus for getting it in the first place, because it gives us our power over nature, which is our signature survival trait above all other species. We can change the world. We can change our environment to be conducive to our survival, rather than being at the mercy of having to adapt to the environment around us. So that was the driver for our intelligence, and we had to have the motivation to use it. So it's perfectly reasonable and natural to assume that a super intelligence would have a super desire to change the world. But in fact, we were under no obligation to program it that way. because it's not created by natural selection for its survival. It's created by us for our convenience. It's a tool. Humans
Mhm.
build tools to amplify our natural skills. Our most powerful natural skill is intelligence. And so an AI with multiplying and combining, amplifying our cognitive powers and the powers to build great models of the natural world is going to be amplified. So it's the ultimate machine, our greatest power, and that's why people get wildly enthusiastic about it. But we're under no obligation to build them with any particular motivation to go out and extend initiative on their own to change the world. In fact, we'll program them not with emotions or motivations at all, except a very simple motivation, which will be implemented as a very simple utility function, which is to be of service to human beings.
Did you know that Everything is a Primary Source now has a series of short videos which, like the podcast, teach social studies concepts through popular culture? Check out the Everything is a Primary Source Finds playlist on YouTube for quick overviews of the artifacts I uncover at Goodwill outlets, pick up from the side of the road, or resurrect from my youth, because I don't throw much out. These are great class starters for teachers, and because each clip ends with citation, they're great for students too. Furthermore, EPS Finds episodes become the starting point for the open source Everything's a Primary Source project, which encourages you and your students, if you have some, to add to the conversation. Or you can just enjoy them as you would any one of the other billions of clips on YouTube. It's up to you. Go to YouTube and become a subscriber to the Everything's a Primary Source channel today. Now, back to the conversation. I think that's where a lot of people, including myself in many cases, I can't fathom the idea of something that behaves in any way like a human, even just talking like a human, not being able to do the things that I can do with my brain. And, having it's like we've been, reminded over and over throughout our lives that, like you said, knowledge is power. The more you read, the more you ingest information, the better you are, and the better you can make choices about those things and be
Mhm.
inspired and be motivated. It's so hard for us to imagine something that carries any kind of similarities to us, not being able to do that.
That's right.
And
Well, exactly. I mean, that's a very important insight because that's part and parcel. We as we try to very carefully model the human psychology, and why do we need to do that? Well, the first thing we're tackling is to allow our sapiens, as we call them, to understand human language. But you can't understand human language in its very, very context of how humans switch from one context to another without understanding humans' feelings and motivations. It's part and parcel to what we are. We call that this sentience of human beings as opposed to their sapience, which is the intellect or the heart and the
Mhm.
mind, if you will. Okay, so we can't imagine that in a sense because we experience both at the same time. We experience thought and intellectual activity at the same time. We experience the underlying feelings and emotional experiences all wrapped together into a common experience. But we don't have to build them that way. What
Mhm.
we are building as essentially new sapiens is an intellect. It's an artificial intellect. It's not an artificial human mind, because human minds have that sentience wrapped into them. So if you did have to have the two to make them together, then people who worry about them getting out of control and taking over would have a very, you know, that's a very reasonable fear. But we're not going to build them that way. Why should we? We want to build them as to be tools to
Mhm.
help us, not to be our inheritors, to go off and replace us with a new species. I mean, you could theoretically do that, but what basis or what basis of figure of merit would you have to do that? Why would you do that?
Mhm.
It's not our intention.
No, yeah, and it's funny because, I think about what I do for a living. I'm a social studies teacher. I therefore am involved mainly in the humanities, the arts. This podcast is all about primarily people's reaction to. I don't deal a lot with the innovation and, um, in this case, computer science or, advanced sciences and technology, but we are still speaking the same language because what you're indicating is exactly what my thesis is that what we humans create, whether it be a TV program or artificial intelligence, is a gestation of time and place. That it's difficult for us, even the most visionary person, the one that has ideas for the future and a vision for the future, is kept back by what actually is in the time, by their surroundings. It's really hard to envision what is next. There's always going to be that limitation. So and therefore futurism, concepts of, okay, in this case, how can we use, we would have called them robots at one point, but in this case, AI, artificial intelligence, artificial intellect, how do we use those as tools? That's a concept that is from our, I mean, it is innate, like you said, it goes back from humans picking up stones and using those as tools. But that concept finds itself where it is because of our environment currently. And I think that
I
goes
think
with
you can.
everything.
I think you have a very valid and profound insight there. Think it through. Going back to and what I've always thought that if you understand to understand human beings, I mean, the study of proper study of humanity is humanity. How do you reverse engineer the human mind and heart? Well, we have the process of evolution. Whether you think we have divine origins or not, there was a mechanism there, which was evolution, and that was under control or not. But nonetheless, you can see that explains that's the best tool we have to reverse engineer the human uh, nature. It's very
Mhm.
hard to take us apart like you would a clock, but we can see how we came to be. Well, so we start changing our environment, right? That's the thing we evolved to do that made us different. So then we change our environment, and now we're in a new environment that wasn't the one we evolved in anymore. So our fundamental motivations that we had evolved that served us well while we lived in nature, maybe they don't recognize their proper objects a little bit. So we build some more and we get into a stranger world. But we're very good always adapting to what we see around us. So every time we do another iteration and build a new world for ourselves, we have the danger of getting farther and farther away from where we started. And after a few iterations of this, we kind of find ourselves kind of being strangers in a strange land that we ourselves created, but we no
Yeah.
longer feel at home anymore. And the more powerful technology gets, the more rapid that cycle of change becomes, and the more rapid we adapt to that. Because if we're not anything, we are adaptable. We will always adapt to optimize the survival of ourselves as individuals, those we care about most, to the surroundings. If it pays
Yeah.
off like a herd animal, we act like a herd animal. If it pays off to be, innovative and creative, then we find that we'll be innovative and creative. We're very, very malleable that way. So now with these very powerful technologies coming at a faster and faster pace, the change becomes faster and faster. So I recently had an interesting insight there. A friend of mine asked me to write a prologue for a book that they wrote called Generation Z's Guide to AI, Ayush Prakash. And he's a colleague of mine now. And as I was writing the introduction, I thought, when did we start naming our generations? And why did we name
Yeah.
them? Now? We never used to. The first time we named a generation was going back to what was the lost generation, the generation that
Yeah. The World War I.
World War One, right? And then we had, in our time, boomers and then millennials, and now we got every generation has its new names, X, Y,
Right.
Z. Why? Well, when I read his book and understood how different Generation Z is from my generation, I got it. And he was telling me things like 70% or 60% of Generation Z get their primary news sources like TikTok, and they judge the veracity of a of a program by how viral it is. And, and I thought, whoa, this technology has really changed the way people are behaving and the way they see the world. So I think
Yeah.
the thesis is spot on. That
That's
content
a that
really
that
does.
it's something I've pondered before as well, and I think I've brought it up on this program before about the idea of generational, and I would even go so far as saying that broad-based, like Lost Generation, for example, it was given that name in the 20s,
Mhm.
right? And you have some great examples of Lost Generation writers and artists and stuff, but I don't think that it was people didn't self-refer to them broadly then. And I'm
No,
not even sure if boomers would have. It seems like a
no.
modern thing to not
Mhm.
only assign these generation titles and traits, almost like astrology in a way, right? Well, you're a millennial, so you act like this, or you're a Gen
It's not a
Xer and
good
you
thing.
do this.
I don't think it's healthy.
No, it's really not, and it because then it kind of predetermines
Yeah.
you and what you're going to be into, and I, I was given the title, and again, this is like a modern thing where like in your lifetime you're given this title of what generation you are. I was born in January of 1981. So it's just like when you look at the astrology charts, am I an Aquarius? It's like, am I a Gen Xer or am I a millennial? And I'm like, I'm just Eric. Like, I have
Right.
interests that I share with Gen Xers because my older brother is a Gen Xer, so I, kind of gravitated towards that. But I also have things that millennials are, I have those kind of traits too. Like, why do we need to do this labeling? And it's a modern thing. It's just like it's really not until you get to the 20th century that history is broken into 10-year increments, that you can study, okay, 1920. And I would even go so far as saying the World War One is that changing event that, people kind of clump 1890 to 1918 into one group. And then after that, it's 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, all the way through. And
Mhm.
it's like that maybe it's just a very um that technique might be coming from the scientific world of compartmentalizing, organizing so you could study in an actual scientific method manner.
Well, you suggested earlier, I thought that the thesis was that the technology that we think of and the technology, that we can imagine is rooted in where the society we are in and the culture we are in at that time. And I agree with that, but I'm also suggesting it's very much a feedback loop that, the technology then affects us. I think the thing about
Yeah,
Generation Z is the people who talk about it say, well, they're different because they're the first ones who really grew up with the internet. It was already there. It was a,
right.
and that was world changing, and it changed them. They adapted to it, and now they are driving the next wave. Will be driving the next wave of technology.
Yeah, their usage of it, I think, sometimes frustrates people who knew a time before the internet. And we're like, why don't you take this more as like a marvel that, it's amazing that we can, what we're doing right now, talking to each other through a screen was something that science fiction movies, that's the only place you could find it for the longest time. And we knew it was probably on its way, but we just didn't know when or how.
Yeah,
They know they don't, that's just like, yeah, well, it's so pedestrian.
I
Somebody
remember.
in like the 50s getting annoyed with their teenagers for being on the phone all the time, not recognizing what a huge, amazing, leap in technology that being able to do long distance phone calls is. And they're just like, just call some. So it's like that weird relationship we have between both generations and the technology.
But it does keep building on itself, and in a way that's not. I've always been a futurist, always been excited to look forward ahead and think about what technologies were out there and took a hand in creating some of them. But as the pace has picked up, and the pace has picked up, if we've gone to communications, to information, and then information to where we are today to generate like seemingly infinite quantities of information, and now we can generate information in the sense of intelligible language. It wasn't really written. It's not actually writing. It looks like writing, but it's not actually communication because it's generated by an algorithm that actually doesn't have anything to communicate. It has no mind. It has no ideas. It has no knowledge. It's just generating what looks like half of a communications protocol. So it's information because you can read it, but it's not directly connected to human minds anymore.
Mm-hmm.
So it's problematical as what that is. And yet we're generating, vast quantities of it, and it's easily and readily accessible by practically everyone for free. Wow.
Yeah.
Nobody saw that coming.
No. And it did just kind of arrive abruptly. It's just, and I mean, that it didn't because you're in the field, but for ordinary everyday folks who aren't in that industry, it was what, 3 years ago that it was just like, wow, here's this,
But it really started in about 2005. I mean, it really started maybe a little earlier with Jeff Hinton, and they first did some machine learning algorithms that could reliably identify what was in an image, in a pixel array, and say, oh, that's a bicycle. And that when the money started pouring in, and then I think 2015 or so, IBM's Watson beat Jeopardy, Ken Jennings at Jeopardy, and it really took off from there. And all of a sudden, and within a very few years, um, uh, machine learning or artificial neural networks became synonymous with AI, and then with LLMs, which are a machine learning application, and the ability to generate this incredibly incredible illusion of intelligence by being able to generate language that is indistinguishable with what a very, articulate human would say. It's a very compelling illusion, and human beings were not prepared for that. And so many people today still think it isn't. It is intelligence. It sounds so good and so reliable and speaks so authoritatively that people are taken in. And that's the concern.
My entire household is humanities people. My wife and I both have history degrees. She's a librarian. I'm a social studies teacher. And what we've learned that, I mean, her job has long been this way, but mine is turning into it. And I'm glad about it. I'm not upset. But what we're doing is not so much teaching specific facts or, write this down that you'll never want to forget this, but more like literacies, right? So historical literacy, how do you find, analyze, and make meaning out of history and the past, really, and write history, but also media literacies. How do you navigate through this? And so what I'm finding, and really seems to be what's on the minds of, because a lot of in the academic world, there's a lot of educators who are either scared of or annoyed by the things that AI can do, particularly in the areas of fabricating student work, that students can just click a button,
It should be.
suddenly things that come up. I'm more concerned with preparing my students for being able to, like I say, navigate. If something, because a lot of the information, a lot of stuff that we receive, especially young people who are scrolling through their phones constantly, they're not seeking it out. It just comes to them. It just
Right.
appears for them. And
Yeah.
so when something is coming from any direction, what should be your thought process of like, who made this? Why did they make it? Why do they want me to see it? What
But
do
you speak of liberal arts, though. Of course, you need to do that as a teacher right now. It's very, very important that your students understand how to navigate this information that's coming at them, because a lot of it, uh, a lot of it could be harmful, and it's not clear that, the idea that somebody gets their news from TikTok is just horrific. So, I mean, that's got to be that kind of discernment is very much should be the purview of an educator today. But in the broader sense, you talked about, liberal arts. I mean, what is an education? It's building as much a complete and consistent internal model of the world as you can possibly have, which isn't a bunch of facts. what's happened to our education system seems to be very illiberal in the sense that even if you went and got a liberal arts degree at most colleges today, it's these narrow, these deep slices of information or knowledge. I can take a degree in modern European history and another one in Shakespeare and another one in Elizabethan, whatever. All these little things, and I get my degree in liberal. I got enough credits. I got a degree in liberal arts, and you got some facts about these times and places and things, but do you have the big picture? Do you have a sense of the grand sweep of history and science? And um, without that kind of thing, by the way, New Sapiens wouldn't exist today. And the reason I say that is our approach to AI or intelligence and building knowledge in machines had to be rooted in the philosophies of epistemology and ontologies, which I wouldn't have been familiar with if I hadn't gone and gotten a liberal arts degree at St. John's College here in Annapolis. So way back then, I was thinking about what is knowledge and what is its relationship to reality, and does it have an underlying structure? So we see, as we are building knowledge into a machine and giving it a world model, we're looking at that. What are the basic, not only the building blocks of structure of knowledge, but what's, we use the analogy that the models that we're building, it's like building a jigsaw puzzle. First, you got to get the pieces and what their shapes and understand how they connect one to the other. Another analogy we use is chemistry. It's like different atoms combined in different ways to create structures which work and others that don't work. So for us, how do we take ideas and connect them together to create sense rather than nonsense? But for a jigsaw puzzle to be put together, you not only have to know the shape of the pieces and how they fit together, but you have to see what is the picture of the box that you're going to look like. That is the world model, in a sense. A picture is a model, right? Not a symbol, it's a model. And so we're building models, not symbols, and not made out of symbols. It directly models the world. It has a resemblance. You can learn about reality by looking at the model we're putting into a machine, but the same approach has direct relevance to a human education. And they need not to be told a bunch of facts, which they'll forget, but they need to kind of understand how the big, the best thing you can give a student is a nuanced understanding of human nature, sentience and sapience. And, the facts are secondary to the big picture. After that, if you have that fundamental broad foundation, then go do what you're interested in and add to that.
No, I agree wholeheartedly. I think that modern education, even traditional style education, there needs to be some flexibility. It can't stand still, right? You don't want to throw everything away, but I think whether it be comparing it to a puzzle or a structure or even a recipe, you need a foundation. You need to have some kind of basis, and then go into the world, like kind of just drop yourself into it, and then everything should make sense, or at least how to make sense out of it.
Exactly.
Like I mentioned before, I have a master's degree in history. Maybe 70 years ago, that would mean that somebody could come up to me and ask me anything about the past and I would be able to tell them, which I can, but no. In reality, when people challenge me to that kind of thing, I'm like, I might not know that exact thing, but I know the method to find out. I know how to use the combination of artifacts, primary sources, and secondary sources to make the best assumption
Yes.
as quickly as possible. And so that's what we should be gifting our students as well now.
That was a great thing about the approach at St. John's. We studied a lot of math, but it wasn't necessarily to master a particular mathematical technique. The underlying thing is, what is math? How does it relate to the world? What kind of tool is it? And the same thing with language and languages. Step back and understand why we studied some ancient Greek and then modern French. How are they different? It wasn't just about the mastery of facts. It was foundational work.
It's almost as if, because I think that I remember a few times, even in undergrad, but absolutely in grad school, where a lot of our classes were seminars and very small groups of people sitting around tables and just talking, not really doing anything else. And it was, that was turn of the century. So I'm thinking by this point, should that, just like everything else you mentioned before, how young kids are using technology now, stuff that was only reserved to, maybe a scientist 30 years ago is now in the hands of little kids. Maybe the educational techniques should also trickle down, that we shouldn't be, having them wait until they get to college just to have that kind of depth that you were just describing introduced to them of,
I think you should start
conceptually, what is this?
should start at the very beginning. And that's what we're doing at Sapience for computers. We're building that fundamental word model. What we are, when we have a first minimally viable product and you turn it on, it will kind of have the common sense world model of, say, a 5-year-old human, but with a perfect memory and ability to understand language. So, and from there you can build on it and build on it and build on it. But you need a computer to have intelligence. You need to bootstrap it. The idea that you could build an artificial brain and have it somehow get itself that way would be horrendously difficult. Although that's what the world's trying to do with AI today. They basically see it as building an artificial brain. We don't. We think the computer off the shelf is a pretty good brain, but it needs to be given a brute something to think about. So we're building that very hand built. It's a big project, but not ridiculously large, to give it that fundamental understanding of what the world is from the utilitarian standpoint. I mean, we don't do metaphysics, we're talking about humans and humans in nature. That's the world we live in.
Popular culture, by definition, connects and unites us, and proves that people of different backgrounds, in fact, have a lot in common with one another. I hope you enjoyed this conversation, at least in part, for that reason. If it connects with you and you'd like to add to it, or any of the podcast episodes, just visit everything-history.com and search for the Everything as a Primary Source project, which can be found in the classroom section of the website. We'd love to hear what you have to say. Be sure to rate and share this podcast wherever you are listening to it now, and follow Everything as a Primary Source on social media, including YouTube and especially Instagram. Thank you for listening to the EPS Podcast, where everything is a primary source.